Great. Hello and welcome to this webinar. This webinar is part of a series that Physmax.com has been producing now for a little over a year. We started this last year called What's the Risk? And so this is part of that ongoing series. And today's webinar's topic is Supercharging Your Management Program. So let's go ahead and get started with this. And then if you have questions throughout the webinar, I'll ask you to hold those till the end, and or I might just stop periodically if it looks like we're getting some questions. And then that way we can kind of take the questions through the end. In this webinar, we're really going to cover a lot of ground, but I promise to try and keep it as simple and straightforward as we can. So as I said, this is part of an ongoing series that we do, and on our webinar, and there's some links at the end of the presentation that will take you there. On our platform, we take these webinars and we host them there, and this gives you the opportunity to actually get CPE credits whenever you have attended one of these. So when this is done, I'll show you the link and you'll be able to go in a day or so. We'll have that posted. We'll let you know, and you can go back and hit the replay, or you can share that if you like. So what we did last year is we looked at cyber events that happened right in the news, and we pulled them out of the headlines and kind of broke them down to say, okay, how would you use this event that just happened in the news to help you as an organization reduce your risk? And how would you use that in an analysis? And then all of that is utilized to help improve your risk management program. So when we're done, and I show you that link at the end, you'll find the other webinars are up there and you can go through, and there's a lot of case studies and that kind of information that we have on there. So this year we wanted to start doing some different topics and cover a few different areas, more management related, policy related, some of these other things. So this is the first one in this new series, and we wanted to start off by focusing on the risk management program itself. So what I tell people is this is a journey, begin wherever you are. So we know that we have organizations that can be quite large and have very mature practice, and then we may have organizations that are just getting started or very small, or maybe you're a startup in a very exciting niche like fintech, for example. But wherever you are in the journey, that's where you want to start. In other words, don't put it off thinking, oh, I have to wait till I have more information, or I have to wait until I've gotten bigger, or I have to wait until I've got all my policies ready together, or any other reason to put off not going ahead and starting a risk management program. So wherever you are in the process, start now, start today is what we say. What we're going to talk about a little bit is what enterprise risk management, what the program would be, what you would include, what that looked like. As I said, for some people that maybe haven't gotten started or they're not as mature as other organizations. So we'll just kind of cover some of the highlights, and then we'll get into more of the meat and potatoes of the webinar that we have. And that meat and potatoes is going to be talking about how to really amp up your practice, your program, by using a risk analysis process. And this isn't going to be terribly technical. And in fact, at the end, I'm going to give you 3 takeaways that you can use and implement immediately in your practice today. So I'm really going to keep it very simple, kind of high level. We'll have a little bit of detail in here, but come along with me and let's walk through this and see if we can't really supercharge your management program wherever you are on the journey. So kind of our roadmap to get started, we're going to start talking a little bit about risk management as an overview, not necessarily in a structural view of the risk management program and all the bits and pieces that you need, but rather how you implement it within your organization and what that means, right? Trying to make it a little more realistic in terms of what does it mean and how you can impact or change that, how you can help it progress forward in its maturity. So we're going to take a look at it from that perspective. And then we're going to talk about risk analysis. In a lot of conversations around a risk management program, the conversation might stay at the level of policies and procedures and how you build a program, a risk management program, the roles and responsibilities, and far more formal structure. But we're not going to focus on it in that way. We're going to focus on how can I leverage my program wherever I am in the process to radically reduce the risk to my organization. How do I do that? How do I have that conversation around risk? What does that conversation sound like? What does it look like? Are the conversations we're having about risk effective or not effective? And how can we make them more useful across the organization? So we're going to be talking about this in some different terms, some things that I hope will be beneficial to you. And that, again, the idea here is that I can give you some pointers and some information that you can take and apply to really improve, immediately begin improving your risk management program wherever it is, by this ability to focus on how to reduce the risk. And then one thing we're going to have a very quick conversation about here is this qualitative versus quantitative. There have been a lot of conversations about these two words. What do they mean? And what I'm going to give you is a really super easy way to go from qualitative to quantitative. Super easy. In fact, little hint, this is going to be one of your takeaways. Then we're going to talk about some probabilistic methods. I know that's a really big word, hard to say. Really what we're saying is that there are mathematical models that you can use, and I'm going to give you one. I'm going to give you a really super easy one, but a very powerful one. And these mathematical models are how we perform this analysis. How do we quantify the risk? Before we can really reduce the risk, we have to understand it, and then we have to be able to quantify it. What does that risk mean to the business? What does it mean in dollars and cents? What's the impact to us? That's part of what I mean when I say quantifying it. We want to make it relative to the organization, something we can easily understand, something that's clearly communicated. So these mathematical models will help you put these into terms that you can clearly communicate and that will help in this area. And then I'm going to give you these takeaway steps. So why do we do all of this? Why do we even need to have a risk management program? Why do we need something that's that formal? Everything that we're going to talk about in here is all focused on reducing the risk to the organization. And that's one of the first key things to start thinking about, as no matter where you are on the journey, as you think about how to improve your risk management program. Because the goal of the risk management program is to support risk-informed decisions. Leadership, in their role, have to make informed decisions. And it's generally our responsibility to make sure that we give them the information that they need to be able to make the decision. So we think of leadership as being the decision makers, policy makers. They're the ones that can set the course of the organization. They're the ones that make the determination on the priorities of what the organization is doing in the larger community. And so they're constantly making these decisions, and they need actionable data, clear, actionable data in order to make those decisions. And so what we're talking about is, by using this risk analysis method, we're going to give them information that they can use to make decisions that lower the risk to the organization. So everything is focused around the goals of the organization. So if you are taking notes, and I often do this in workshops and in courses, this would be the point where I would say, take a note of that, put that at the top of your page. Number one, everything is focused around the business goals. So leadership will make a statement of the business goals and risk tolerance, two pieces there. So if you are already established, you want to make sure, do we really have a clearly stated statement of what our goals are and what's the risk tolerance related to that goal? Each goal should have, along with it, some statement of risk. If you're going to achieve anything, it doesn't matter who you are or what you're doing, if you're a business or if you are an athlete or just an individual, if you have goals, you want them clearly stated. And then with that, you will have the set of steps that you're going to follow to achieve the goal, but you also have to have in there the statement of what you're not willing to do in order to achieve that goal. Or another way to put it is what you must have, and ensuring that the risk is mitigated to ensure that you have everything you need to succeed. That's another way to look at it. And so that's really what we're saying here. You can think of it on a personal level, you can think of it as a small business or in a large business, but everything begins with the business goals, what risk you can accept, what risk you cannot accept in order to achieve the goal. So that would be number one. Number two, big note to take is there are multiple views of risk. Leadership, as well as everybody in the organization, will have a different view of risk. And this is the first part where we talk about having a conversation around risk. This is where we first begin to have that conversation, because the view of risk of the two parties involved in the conversation can be quite different. So as we talk about risk, if you're starting a program, this is a good point to start thinking about what's your view of risk in your organization. And when you need to communicate that in a larger organization, what is management's view of risk? If I'm delivering a report to management and I'm talking about risk in a way that they're not concerned with, my message isn't going to be received the way that I want it to be received and understood. Does that make sense? So the typical views of risk fall into these categories: operational, financial, and reputation. There may be other views of risk that you're concerned with, but these are the three primary ones. You could also have supply chain as a view of risk, that's really important. If your organization relies on the supply chain for building products or services, and you feel at risk or there are enough variables that could put you at risk, that may be a very typical way then that you communicate and discuss risk. So as well as understanding the business goals, because we're going to align everything to the business goals, the next thing that you probably want to do is be very clear on what view of risk is important to leadership and to the organization, because that's where you're going to be having your conversations. So if either of these two key pieces here are off, everything else is going to be problematic, because it will not be properly aligned and the conversations will not be targeted and will not be well received because they're out of alignment. So these first two things are super important in improving or building your risk management program. So the next thing that we would do is now identify the risks. So if I've identified the goals and I know what my business is going to do and I know what's important to me in that business, then I've kind of said, this is what I need to have to get done. So now anything that prohibits this is a risk. And so now I want to kind of identify those. So I want to ensure my success. So I want to identify the things that I have to pay attention to make sure that I can achieve what I wanted to. And then for each of these, you will start to identify what is that threshold of risk. So if I have financial instability up to a level, I can accept that. But if it goes beyond that, I can't accept it, because now I won't be able to succeed at my goal of what I had set for my business. And that's the way you want to think of it and phrase it for each area of risk, whether it's operational, financial. If you want to put supply chain up there, you can, or whether it's dealing with your business's reputation. So you kind of want to identify what you're trying to achieve, and then that will make it kind of obvious the things that you want to make sure you can control so that you're successful. That's the way you want to think about the risk here. And again, as I said, everything in this should be aligning to the goals of the business. If it's not aligned with the goals of the business, you're going to have a very hard time getting leadership to hear this because it's not important to them. And at that point, you should stop and ask yourself, is this really headed in the right direction? Or do we need to realign something? Do we need to have a conversation about this? Or is this something that you need to bring to leadership's attention to point out that this is, you know, something that they should have on their radar? But all of these things are the foundation of having an effective risk management program. If you have these things properly spelled out, and by this I mean your statement of your business goals should be something that is in writing on a piece of paper, that is published and distributed throughout your organization. Everyone in the organization should know what the business goals are and how their role aligns with achieving these business goals. You can even use this to build culture within your organization. And if you can do that successfully and you build a culture all pushing toward the same goal, that's really powerful within an organization, and people can get very excited and have a lot of strong identity with the business working together, headed toward that goal. You can get a lot of goodness out of an effective risk management program beyond thinking of it in terms of policies or procedures. But again, I can't overstress these basics. So having clearly written and identified distributed, communicated business goals. Now do the same thing for your risk tolerance. So if we think of risk tolerance, one example everybody does in larger organizations, they'll have a limited amount of hours or minutes that they can tolerate being down, right? So if the systems are down, production isn't occurring, we're losing money by the hour. And so you'll see those kinds of statements. But you want that kind of a statement for everything that could potentially risk the success of your business goals. So if you're talking about supply chain, then you want to have the same risks written down. You can't tolerate whatever the delays might be, whether it's product delivery or whether it's service delivery, depending on what you're doing that you're relying on that supply chain for. And so you'll go through a process of identifying these and then coming up with mitigation. So you might, for example, diversify these support services or products that you're receiving. You might diversify the partners that you use and rely on. So all of these conversations, this is the primary starting point. If you can get this part correct, everything else will succeed. You don't have to worry about what my policy looks like or the format, or you don't have to worry about, are the procedures sufficient? You won't have to worry about those things as much, because if you have these basics in place, everything else will fix itself. But if you don't have these in place, nothing else is going to run right, and you will constantly have problems. So now that we've kind of laid that, I'll move on. So risk is uncertainty. Up to this point, we've kind of used this word, and we continue to use this word. And I'm always talking about how to communicate effectively. So on this slide, I really want to get this idea across that risk is uncertainty. It's not a question of could my supplier be impacted and not be available to me. It's more the uncertainty of, would that happen? How often would that happen? What would happen if he's not available? It's the uncertainty, it's the unknown. So when we talk about risk, at the same time, unstated, unconscious, but still there, is this dialogue that we want to have about, well, how can I ensure my success? If I have uncertainty, how can I get myself to a point where I have less uncertainty and I have more confidence in what the outcome is going to be in an event? That is the entire conversation about risk, risk management, the analysis that we're going to do, everything that we're going to do. That's kind of the underlying conversation. Risk is uncertainty. And the more that I can minimize the uncertainty by gaining information, gaining assurances, being able to have a forecast of likelihood. The more that I can gain this comfort, the less risk that exists. And there's lots of ways that we can get there, and analysis is one of the key ways we're going to do that. So the next phase we're going to talk about here is how we go about performing an analysis and a report that we can communicate to leaders and others about the risk in our program related to whatever organizational goals that we're focused on. So that's the next thing that we're going to talk about, is this analysis process. And I'm sure everybody, so if you're in an organization of size, you're already probably doing this kind of stuff, and you may be using a wide variety of analytical methods and types of risk analysis within your organization. So some of these you might be using could be a standard that you have adopted. It could be a law or regulation that you are complying with. So if you are, and a lot of that comes around the data that you're processing. So if you're in the health field, you have HIPAA data, so there will be compliance that you have to do there. And so you will have risk analysis around that data, and that might be one way that you have an analysis. If you're processing credit card information, you have PCI compliance you have to do. If you're a federal government, you have this entire structure around protecting federal data and federal systems. And so you have that kind of compliance that you have. You might have legal obligations that you have to remain compliant with. But there are lots of reasons already, just in the normal course of doing business, that you probably have something that compels you to perform, or have somebody do this for you, some type of a risk analysis or an assessment. So if you have these, great, start where you are. Remember, we said it's a journey, start where you are. If you don't have any of these, you still want to do this for the primary reason that you want your business to succeed. And as we said before, if you're an athlete, if you're an organization, if you're an individual, it works the same in every case. You need to set a goal, and then you need to consistently do what is necessary to achieve the goal. And part of that is understanding what are the risks or the potential roadblocks, and how do I overcome those? And so that's part of the reason that you would do a risk analysis if you didn't have compliance already. If you already have compliance, likelihood is that you're going to want to do this kind of risk analysis, because compliance looks at risk from its own viewpoint. Remember, we said a few minutes ago that you could look at risk from operational viewpoint. You could look at it from financial, maybe supply chain is important to you, reputation, compliance can be a viewpoint, the perspective that's important to you. Any of these can be a perspective of risk, but your leadership within your organization, you will need to decide what's the view that's most important to you, and that will drive the type of analysis that you do. So as we move into this analysis, you want to identify what data you have available. You will use a scenario to help you describe the threat and the actions that your organization can do in response to that threat. And then you will quantify the risk, and I'll give you a formula for that. That's one of the takeaways I'm going to give you, is this formula. It's really super easy, but I want you to understand the formula. And that's how we quantify the risk, right? So we're going to do a little bit of math. I swear it's a little bit of math. And then once you've quantified it, another thing that you will do is assign an impact. So once you've quantified the risk, you've made it understandable, then you also want to understand what's the impact to the organization if that event occurs. And then you want to prepare a report, and you want it to be quantitative. That's the method that leadership repeatedly in research Q&A responses say that they appreciate and can understand and use best, is quantitative, using numbers. In other words, putting numbers to the risk, putting numbers to the impact, putting numbers to outages and downtimes and that kind of thing, rather than using qualitative, which is just more descriptive and it doesn't really have the numbers behind it. So then you'll put together this estimate, you'll assign the impact. In other words, you put numbers to it. Now you're going to say how that impacts the business. You'll describe that. And then that's usually called a risk rating. And you'll put that together into a report. With that, you'll generate charts and they'll all be goals based and then based on whatever that view of risk is. So that's kind of the overview of this risk analysis that we're talking about that you will do. So now let's talk a little bit about qualitative versus quantitative. What's the difference between these two words? Charlene, help me. I don't know what they mean. So here's how I would describe it. Qualitative sounds like this. We've performed a risk analysis and the findings are listed in the report. Given the protections we have in place, we've deemed this a moderate risk. So that is their explanation. They've told you they've done the work and they've decided that it is a moderate risk. Now let's compare that to a quantitative delivery. Based on the data available, we estimate a 20 to 40% probability of a negative event in the next 6 months, resulting in an operational outage from 1 to 20 days at a cost of between $350,000 to $900,000. Can you see the difference between these two? In the quantitative, we have hard numbers. We have risk expressed as a range of probability. Remember, we said risk is uncertainty. So there's some uncertainty in that range, but we can get it to a range. It won't be greater than this and it won't be less than this. We can get it to a range. And then do you see how we also said within a time period that the event might occur? And then what was the view we were giving was operational? What was the impact? It was an outage. What kind of outage? It might last for 1 day to 20 days and it gave a, so this is the difference between a qualitative report summary and a quantitative. And so this is why we say leadership prefers to have quantitative because now they have data that they can act on. The qualitative is informative, but it still isn't as descriptive and as actionable as the quantitative. So you say, Charlene, look, we're doing qualitative now. This is what we've been doing. That other sounds really interesting, but I don't know how to get there. So that's what I'm going to show you now. This is part of the takeaway that I'm going to give you is how do you get from qualitative to quantitative easily? So this is going to be very easy, not going to be very complicated. Let me show you how we're going to do this. So if you are using a qualitative method, you're using terms like it's a very high risk or a moderate risk, or that's a very low risk. And so that's really a 1 through 5 scale. And so what I like to do is say, look, if you're going to get started, start wherever you are on the journey. If you're using qualitative, we'll start there. If you don't have anything yet, this is a great reference for how to get started. If you've already been doing this and you have some tools in place, this can make it very easy for you to get beyond that point and to go farther in that conversation. And remember, this is all about how do I express risk and how do I have that communication so that it's very clear. If I just use terms and I say that's a moderate risk, and I'll give you a perfect example, and this happens all the time. We can have 2 systems that are reviewed for risk, and the reports come up. These are very different systems, and both of them come up to say, oh, they're both a moderate risk. Well, does that mean that if this one in this scenario has an outage for 4 hours, but this one in that scenario would have an outage of 2 weeks, how can these both be a moderate risk? Or if in this scenario, this one would have a financial impact of this amount that's very different, how can they be a moderate, how can they both be a moderate risk? How can that be? This term, moderate, until we have put numbers to it, and until we have given it a definitive range, it becomes so loosely defined that it doesn't have any meaning anymore. And that's where you see in most practices where they're doing qualitative, that's what you see. And that's the confusion that leadership has. And that's where the quantitative analysis will start pulling these apart and making it very clear so that you can compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges to bananas, right? So what I say is start where you are. If you're using qualitative, or if you just want to start and have language that's clear, start with a 5 scale. Most people will agree very high sounds quite different than high, than moderate, low, and very low. So having a 5-point scale instead of a 3-point scale adds some clarity in the terms, because you can think of a worst case, a best case, and a most likely and a best case. You can see, and then you have 2 more in between to kind of differentiate. So 5 is a good scale, is what I'm saying. 5 is a good scale. So start with 5, and then to make it clear, split them up in 20 percentile ranges. And so you've got, this should be a 20 right there, 0 to 20. So it should be 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60. And then it becomes very clear. Now people can understand with the simple scale, they can understand, a high and a very high. And I can see by my scale where the delineation is between one and the other. So let's start with this scale. And now we're going to walk through some more information, and then we're going to come back to the scale, and I'll show you how to use this to do a quantitative analysis to get from qualitative to quantitative and how we do that. Now we're going to talk about some of the probabilistic methods. So here's where we're going to start talking about some mathematical theory and a little bit of math. Not a lot, but a little bit of math. So when we quantify risk and we do this analysis, we're putting numbers to uncertainty. And there are a couple of very basic methods that are used everywhere in the world and in every kind of situation to do this. And these are what I call the probabilistic methods. These are the ones I'm going to explain to you. These are the same methods that are used in finance. They are the same methods used, like if you're talking about how a financial investment might perform, okay? So that in financial analysis, these same methods are used. They're used in epidemiology. How does the doctor know, for example, if I smoked for 20 years, what's the likelihood I'll get lung cancer? Well, these are the same methods that are used to make these projections. What about in seismology, right? These same methods are used there. These methods are also used in space and nuclear safety analysis, where they're looking at the characteristics of a physical component failing. What's the likelihood that this component might fail? These are the same methods that are used. We just haven't used them in cybersecurity. Now, if you're in a larger organization, you may have some project management folks, people who've gotten certified, they've got their PMP. Some of these methods I'm going to talk about are used in project management. And so you might not realize it, but there's, I think the last method I have listed here is used in project management. So these methods can be used anywhere, and they are used, prolific, they're everywhere. And these are mathematical models because the math helps explain, in mathematical terms, the behavior of events in real life. And so these models have held up the test of time, and they've been used in all types of situations, and they're consistent and they are trusted. And so these are the methods that I'm going to explain to you, just so that you can understand the terms and then how you can apply this. Everything I'm going to give you here, except for one, I think, everything here, you can go back and employ in your organization immediately without tools. One, you kind of need to have some tools to do. The math it's easier if you have the tools to do it. So let's go through these. So the first method is called Bayesian theory. So Bayesian theory is really pretty simple. All that it says is that I have a prior belief, I do some analysis, and that gives me an outcome of information, which I then use to update my prior belief with a new belief, and then I will analyze again. And the Bayesian theory was a mathematical model designed to describe how we learn. This is the learning process. I think this is the case. I think this is true. I think this estimate is correct. Let me test it. So then I do my analysis and I test it. The outcome tells me how close I was to the reality in my initial belief. Then I can go and update my initial belief. I can refine it. This is an iterative process, and you want to apply Bayesian theory to your analysis. Basically, this is just saying that you don't want to do a risk analysis with a scenario once a year and you never go back and look at it, you never touch it again. Instead, you want to update that every time there's more information that could impact that scenario. So when I do analysis, and in the same thing that we did last year in our What's the Risk series of webinars, we took cyber attacks right out of the news. And we said, oh, if this attack is occurring, let me look at this and see how this could impact my organization. And we broke that apart, and we broke down, how did this attack occur? What were the attackers doing? What were they after? How did they do that? From that, we learn, oh, well, there are some best practices that I could use that would lower my risk and prevent the attackers from being able to achieve their goal. So now I understand the attack. I now understand best practices. And also, because I now understand the best practices, I can now begin to quantify the risk, because I know if I have a best practice in place, that lowers my risk. If I don't have it in place, then that increases my risk. And so by breaking down a cyber attack, you gain all of this useful information. And now you can use this as a scenario, not just for that one attack, but for entire groups of attacks that behave this way. If you were looking at an operating system as the attack target, or an appliance, or a particular system, or a library, or a physical architecture, right? And you can use scenarios in your risk management program for anything. It doesn't have to be a cyber attack. You can use scenarios. If your supply chain is your core issue, you would use a scenario that is about an outage based on a problem with a supplier. And that scenario could be something that's driven by natural events. It could be driven by a cyber attack. It could be driven by economic pressures. It could be from geopolitical events. It could be from any number of events, but you take that scenario, and by walking through the scenario, you then begin to understand how things work together or against each other. You begin to understand how one step in a process the outcome can increase or reduce the risk. And so now you not only have the process and the risk analysis, you have best practices that you get out of this exercise, but then you can also begin to quantify the risk. If I have this step that is mitigating the risk, then I know I have less risk. If not, I know I have more risk. And so those are the things, when you go through the scenario, those are the things you pull out, and those are the things that help inform the threat and the likelihood of that event, a negative event occurring. So I hope this is making sense, this discussion about the scenarios and how you will do this several times. So let's say you've done a scenario. Let's say we did a scenario for a cyber attack. The patch came out, you've got the patch done, but how many times do attackers go after a Microsoft product in a year? Pick any Microsoft product. It can be any, it doesn't have to be Microsoft, any product, any program, any operating system. More than once. And often if they find a weak component, they'll find an attack the patch will come out, then they'll find another way to breach it because it's a weak component, and they'll do that over and over again. So that's why I was saying the Bayesian theory allows you to iteratively run a scenario. And again, the scenario can be a cyber attack. The scenario can be an outage caused from an issue with a supplier. It can be anything within your organization, but it allows you to run the process over and over again, making all these minor changes, playing these what if scenarios. Each time, the goal is to increase your security and lower your risk by making small adjustments as you do each cycle through, and then also having multiple scenarios. So the scenarios go back to our earlier discussion of what were the goals. Start with your goals, what you wanted to achieve, what's the risk to each of these, where's the limit that you don't want to surpass. Now, what are the scenarios that could cause this risk to impact your goals? And then every scenario you can think of, that those are the scenarios you want to run. And that's the reason and how you go about picking what scenarios you want to run. So the Bayesian theory simply says, I'm going to run these multiple times. Every time something new pops up and I have new information, I'm going to run it again. Periodically, I might run it because I have new information about one of my vendors, or my vendor has changed something. I'm looking at supply chain. I might run it every time I've updated a process or a procedure. And I want to test that out and see how that has impacted my risk level. I might want to run a risk analysis every time I see a new type of attack against a component that I have in my network. Let's say I have a big, powerful perimeter appliance. Pick any of them. Cisco, any of them, doesn't matter. F5, any of them that you can think about. Every time I see that there's a vulnerability that's come out, or a patch that's come out, or there's an attack, I want to go back and look at the scenarios I have related to that device and see, how does this impact what I thought my security was for this? Did that event change what I thought my security level was? Maybe my security is not as good as I thought it was because I now have evidence in the real world that this can be compromised in an unforeseen way. Let me go back and update my analysis and update what I have shared with leadership as our risk related to this component. Does this make sense? In other words, you will use this iterative process and you will have many, many scenarios of risk, all related to the business goals, and you will update them every time something relative to them changes that prior belief. Make sense? Excellent. So this is a very powerful concept. I know I've spent some time going over it, but it's because it's very powerful. Now I want to explain to you the next powerful piece about this. One of the reasons that I love the Bayesian theory, not only because, as we've just explained, in logical terms, it's how we learn. And so by using it, we put ourselves into a posture of being an ever improving learning program. Our risk management program is now on solid footing because it is now always evolving, always improving, and we're always learning, and we do it in an iterative fashion. Combined with that, I want to explain the Bayesian joint probability. This is the foundation of a little piece of math I'm going to give you, one equation that I'm going to give you, and so that you understand why this simple equation is actually very, very powerful. So when we talk about these Bayesian probabilities, think of them as a Venn diagram. So we know we talked up to this point, we talked about threat and we talked about the likelihood. So I have some kind of a threat, and that threat can be, I have a weakness, I have a vulnerability, or I have an unpatched system. That's kind of a threat. It's not a risk yet. In order for this to get beyond this point, a threat actor has to act on that. And that is where we say, what's the likelihood that a threat actor will actually act on that? So I have my threat or my weakness, and then I have the likelihood that that weakness will be exploited. Think of these as two circles. Bayesian tells us that when these two circles cross like a Venn diagram, The area where they cross is the risk. Mathematically, we express this like this. Threat times likelihood, the area where they overlap, that's risk. So this simple formula where we say, well, what's the threat? What's the likelihood? Well, multiply these two numbers. How do we get to this point? It's based on advanced mathematics that we simplify. So when we say that the equation of risk is threat times likelihood, there is a lot of very beautiful math behind this very simple equation. This is one of the primary methods that is used, as I said, in seismology, safety analysis. It's used everywhere. And it goes back to the simple concept of a Venn diagram, and where threat and likelihood meet mathematically is a multiplication. As we get further in, I'll give you some examples of this, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Just keep it in mind, write that one down. The equation for risk is threat times likelihood, because it's a Bayesian joint probability, right? Excellent. Now, the next method that we'll talk about is called a Monte Carlo simulation. And I want you to understand this because you might, if you don't already have tools that can do this, this might be one that you want to get the tools for. And let me explain why and how powerful the simple thing is. So Monte Carlo simulation is the process of mathematically, once you have your range from the top, and we said risk is a range, and you say, oh, well, I have a most likely, a worst case, and a best case scenario. Remember our five ranges. So I'm going to look at as I look at my probability, I'm going to say, what's my worst case? What's my best case? And someplace in here, I have my most likely. And this is the piece that your folks who have gotten their PMP and your project managers, they've been exposed to this concept, and they also can help you if you're struggling with this to understand the Monte Carlo and the probability distribution that I'm going to talk to you about. So what Monte Carlo says is it's a mathematical model that if I give the model, what's the value for my most likely, right? My most likely, my best case, and my worst case, it will mathematically show you what the likelihood of events are in a distribution form that very closely matches reality. Remember that we said this math is powerful because it mathematically expresses reality. And that's what the Monte Carlo simulation does. So it mathematically generates probabilities based on the input, and then it creates this chart that we can call a probability distribution. Now, there's some very beautiful math behind this. And once you have a tool that can generate this, and our tools do 1,000 generations for each probability that you're modeling. So you'll give it worst case, best case, most likely, and it'll generate 1,000 probabilities that within that range, this is the likelihood probability of how many events will occur over 1,000 events. How do they stack? And that always comes out as a curve. And that's called a probability distribution. Now, depending upon which one you use, that curve might be more peaked, it might be more flattened out, more curved, right? But those are details. But the idea is that mathematically, you can forecast the likelihood of an event and the value of what that event is. That's pretty powerful stuff. So now let's go to put this all together. So now I'm going to give you some simple, how can I do this now? You're saying, Charlene, I heard all this. This sounds great. All this math is wonderful, but how do I do this? I don't have any tools. Well, you can actually do it very simply. And that's what I'm going to show you here. And this will get you started right away. So what you do is, remember that we said you're going to use a scenario. So take a scenario, take one of your business goals, and let's say your business goal is, it can be anything. It can be effective communication with your clients. And that effective communication is supported by some technology in between there. probably a couple of different components. But let's say that's the goal, to have effective communication with your clients so that they have an online application that they use, and that interface is always up and available, and they really like it, and that's how you share information with them. So the scenario of risk might be something that would threaten the supporting technology so that it would become unavailable. That's your threat scenario. And there could be any number of ways, kinds of cyber attacks, even accidents that could occur, that infrastructure to not be available, right? And so you estimate, well, okay, so let's say that our threat is a cyber attack. Okay, what do we have in place? How secure is our system? When you come to the agreement and you say, well, I think that the threat, the weakness that we have, the threat we have is really very low. Okay, so very low is 20 to 40%. Let's use 20%. And this is our best case we're working on. So we're going to say our threat is 0.2, right? That's another way to express 20% as a decimal. So our threat is very low. That's only 20%. But the likelihood that somebody could compromise that if there were, in our scenario, a vulnerability, a known vulnerability that there wasn't a patch to, that likelihood of being attacked would then be very high. So a very high, that starts at 80. So we'll use 0.8, that's 80. So if we use our Bayesian joint probability, what did we say the equation for risk was? Threat times likelihood. So if my threat is 0.2 and my likelihood, which is very high, is 0.8, what's the probability that a negative event would occur? 16%. 0.2 times 0.8 is 0.16. That is mathematically a joint probability. That's our best case. Well, what's the worst case? If that's the best case, what's the worst case? Well, the worst case is that we didn't secure that system, and like we got some really bad programmers, and the code's very weak. It can be hacked really easy. Wow, our threat is very high. Very high is between 80 and 100. We're just going to use 0.8 for this example. So our threat, our weakness, is very high. And the likelihood that somebody would attack it as a cyber attack, if there were a known unpatched vulnerability, is very high. That's 80%. So 0.8 times 0.8 is 0.64. So we could have a range of between 64% in a worst case and 16% in a best case. That's our range. We've now defined our upper and lower boundaries. Well, what's the most likely? We do the same thing for the most likely. Well, most likely, it's only a moderate weakness. We've got a pretty good system. We need to do more to secure it, but it's not bad. So this is how we develop that range. Does that make sense? And now you have your range, and you only needed one beautiful equation backed by some solid math and science and a very basic way to do this. Does this make sense? I hope this is making sense. Now, let's keep going and put the rest of it together. So here are some of the challenges that you're going to have when trying to supercharge your management program. People are going to say, isn't qualitative good enough? Well, you know, it's kind of good enough, but it doesn't give a numerical expression. It doesn't talk about risk as being a range, right? So it can be kind of ambiguous when we say it's a moderate risk. What's that really mean, right? Well, we don't have enough data. That's another one that people will say, we don't have enough data. The beauty about using probabilistic math is that it's best used when you have little to no data. That's kind of what makes it excel. The more data you have, the more you can refine your estimates, but the mathematical models give you that analysis piece. So if you don't have any data, your estimates will be wider. The more data you have, your estimates will be more refined, because you've eliminated some uncertainty because you have data to back it up. Does that make sense? Less data, more uncertainty, more data, less uncertainty. Somebody says, I hate math. Me too. I absolutely hate it. When I created these models for myself, I wanted it to be really simple because I hate math too. That's why I gave you one equation. And that's pretty simple. So how do you account for the impact to an organization? Great question. The impact is a value, And it's described in terms that are unique to the scenario and your organization. In our earlier example, we talked about an outage that could be a certain number of hours and that it might have a financial cost that is in a certain range. The impact is something that you build estimates for with other data collaboratively in your organization. The math that we're talking about to help do the quantification part is in taking the data in, the estimate, doing that mathematical piece, and the impact is something that you discuss in your organization. Well, if this happened, and the likelihood is pretty high that this could happen, what's the impact? You discuss this with your organization and you'll begin to understand, well, that could cause an outage. How long will you be out? Well, we don't have good duplication of personnel. So if that occurs, the outage could be quite long. That information comes from discussing it within the organization. When you've done the analysis and you have that piece to share, then you have this conversation. Those impacts can be given numbers, like on a 1 through 5 scale, and then you can multiply that to your risk, and now you're rating the risk, and you can do other things. There's lots. Once you've done the initial analysis piece, then there's a lot that you can do to that and add to that. I just wanted to get you to a point where you could easily, with one equation, do this preliminary basic, the core concept of your analysis. What are probabilistic methods, somebody could ask? Well, now that we've had the conversation, you can explain to them they're the same methods used in seismology, epidemiology, they're used in finance, and now we start using them in cybersecurity, they're used in safety analysis, and it's this thing called Bayesian joint probability, and that's where the formula comes from. So you can have that conversation with them. So here are the takeaway steps. Express risk as a range or a probability for which you estimate the likelihood of an event occurring. Number 2, begin using quantitative ranges to replace your qualitative labels. If you can do these first 2 things, this will put you on a trajectory to transition your program in a year's time, 6 months. It depends on how fast you want to move. That's up to you. But that is the foundation of transitioning your program from qualitative to quantitative. And then leverage the multiple views of risk and discuss the possibility in terms of impact to the organization by operations, financial impacts, supply chain impacts, reputation impacts, and any other impacts that are important to your organization aligned with those business goals. So those are the takeaways. I hope I have covered this in enough detail so that it is useful and something that you can quickly go back and assimilate in your own organization. And now I want to take just a few minutes and kind of open this up and see if we have any questions or anything that I can address for you. So if you have any questions, you can put those in the Q&A. I don't think we have, okay, so there's nothing in the chat right now. Okay, so one question that I see, and this comes up a lot, is, okay, I've heard that there are some really expensive enterprise tools out there. I haven't been trained on any of this stuff. How can I get started? It seems like it's going to be an expensive journey to complete. So here's what I say. This is the reason that I ended up creating a toolkit to do this kind of work, because when I needed to do it for myself or a client, that's exactly what I found. I found that everything in the market was enterprise tools. They wouldn't even sell it to me because I'm an independent consultant, right? They don't even deal with little people like me. They want to sell to big organizations, and I understand it. They've got big programs, big applications, they're sitting up in the cloud. So what I developed was something that was easy, lightweight, portable. I could understand it quickly because I based it in Excel. I developed it in cybersecurity terms, which is how I speak about risk. And I didn't need to be a mathematician to understand. The tool does the quantification piece for me. All I have to do is say, this is my scenario, and this is what I think my estimate is. I think it's someplace between this amount and this. Let me start with this, because remember Bayesian, I'm going to start with this and see what that outcome is. And then I'll refine that again. So I can come back in and run that scenario again. And then I can do that as many times, playing those what if scenarios. So that's exactly how I ended up creating these and doing these for myself. And if you go to our website, and I'll give you that right here. So the website is physmax.com. You'll find a couple of things up in the top menu. You'll find some resources, and something that you'll find there is a link that will take you over to our training platform. So we have an educational community. We have part of the content there is absolutely free. There's no cost to join the community. It's an open access. We put this on this platform because it generates the CPE certificate of completion every time you watch one of the webinars, one of the case studies, any of that content. We also have a free course that walks you in more detail through all of these quantification methods and concepts. And then we have the tools that I've made that are for sale. And basically one of these is what's called a FAIR model. FAIR is another standard in the industry that's financially focused. It expresses risk in financial terms. So I have a mathematical model that complies with all of those requirements to be standard with FAIR. And then I also have my own, which is called probabilistic risk modeling for cyber, PR mod for cyber. And it's a spreadsheet with multiple tabs, multiple tools for looking at risk from multiple perspectives. And it will help you mathematically model operational risk, cyber attack modeling, supply chain risk, tabletop exercises for process improvement. It has all of the components that the FAIR model has as well. But in our FAIR model, those components work in a very structured sequence. In the PR mod for cyber, I can interchange and use different models and in combination with each other, and in fact, in any combination that I want. So it's extremely easy to use, fluid, very easy. It's all in Excel, so it's very straightforward, easy to understand. Well, I seem to have taken up our hour. I don't see any other questions. I will stop here and just simply say thank you for your time. I hope you have found something useful and of value. And please, if you have any comments or feedback, you can find me on social media. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter, and you can always go hit the website. And you can also just send me an email, and I respond back to all of those personally. So I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next one.